Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 2. I hope that this is finding you all well. I hope that you had a great weekend. As I mentioned on my Sunday video, and just so you know, I typically record these on the weekends, so that video isn't out yet, but hopefully you all watched it and you all got the extra credit that was in there. If not, then you'll know for next time, although I rarely do extra credit. I just felt inspired to do that one for this one. So you got through week 1. It was a bit bumpy for some of you, but now you've gotten through a week. You kind of know the rhythm of how things go. However, for the next 3 weeks, there's going to be something added, which is that you're going to have your 3 big tests, which are made up of 2 parts. And I want to just talk about that here at the start so that I don't forget, to be honest. So every module has a quiz. It's typical in a lot of classes to have a midterm and a final. For me, because of all the material that's just constantly moving through this class, I broke it up into thirds, really more for the benefit of all of you. You had fewer modules, fewer chapters that you had to focus on to remember. Because as much as I realize that there is a component to education and learning about, bringing back knowledge that you've learned, it's just a small piece of it for me, but it is important in the details. I don't want this to necessarily just be like a trivia class, which is the way that some people teach it. So even if you've noticed on your quiz questions, I'm asking, a lot of them are pretty easy, but if you think about it, you should be able to answer it if you've gone through the materials. And so that's the way that they work. So instead of having midterm and final, we have 3 tests that are each made up of, depending how the class breaks up, 6 to 7 modules in there. This class, because it is a 4-week class, you needed you to get into the material for last week, but those tests are going to open up. So for the next 3 weeks, you're going to have those as well. And there are 2 parts. Part 1 is 100 questions worth 200 points. It's a big chunk that are primarily drawing from your quiz questions. They are timed like your quizzes are, and they're pretty factual kind of stuff. They will open on Thursday mornings, and they are due by the end of the day on Sunday. So you have some freedom and flexibility on when you want to do them. Part 2, which is a separate part, you can also do it differently, is listening. And so basically you're going to listen to, I'm going to have Spotify links. So make sure you have a Spotify account, that you have it up and running when you do these assignments. If you don't, it's going to get stuck, and that's going to be problematic because these things are timed. You will obviously, because it's a Spotify link, be able to see the artist and title, so I don't make those the questions. A lot of you, maybe some of you have had classes like that before, and I've taught classes for years. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and so a lot of that's what you had to identify. There was another way I could have done it, but I decided to do this differently in that you'll listen to the song, and then I will ask you something about the song that is more related to how does this typify the genre, or what aspect in this song is typical of this particular genre. So that's going to be in there as well. Same thing, that also opens up on Thursday, closes on Sundays. So you'll need to get those done. As I've said before, I don't accept late work. So once those lock up and they shut down, they are done. So if you're out of town, if your Wi-Fi failed, if things happen, plan ahead. Do not wait until Sunday night to knock out your assignments, because stuff happens and I can't make accommodations for everybody, especially not in this class that moves so quickly. I know I've said that a bunch of times, but that's the case, okay? So you will have the first of those 3 this week, and then there will be one every week. Also, don't forget about that concert report, because that is due. You can turn that in early. So I recommend doing so. Don't wait till Sunday night and thinking, oh, hey, I got to do this. Get it done early. Get it done ahead of time. Take that off. I personally, I'd prefer to get these things all knocked out by Friday so I could enjoy my weekends, but I'm kind of an anal retentive workaholic kind of guy. So that's how I work. This is a great time to really get to know how you work. I had you go through those early materials on learning in the last previous week, and then maybe even to retool them. I was like a so-so student in high school. I got a little better as a student working on my undergraduate degree. But when I did my master's degree, by then it finally like kicked in, and my way of working and my ways of learning totally changed. So, that's always can be done. Don't think like, oh, this is how I do it and this is who I am for life. Nope. Can totally change those things at any time if you want to. Okay. So this week we're going to have 5 modules. Last week you learned about a lot of the foundation, the roots of rock. So and rock and roll and all of that. So you learned about folk and the roots coming over from Europe. You learned about blues. You learned about the intersection of music that was created when you had the combination of Black traditions and European traditions coming in. You learned about ragtime, you learned about jazz, you learned about blues, how it evolved from country classic Delta blues into urban blues, which then moved into rhythm and blues. You learned about how rhythm and blues became rock and roll, and that rhythm and blues, rock and roll was really just a renaming of rhythm and blues that was more safe from a racial perspective, i.e., a lot of parents, white families in particular, and it's easy. I've had students ask me in the past, like, how come we're always talking black and white and all of that? What about other races? And while there were other races and there were things, I'm a particular fan of Mexican / Latino / Chicano, that music history. There's some cool books on my bookshelf. You can find them in the readings. I actually know some of the people that are important in that scene. That's just a personal interest of mine. So there was some of that. There's a whole history of that going. There's a book I think they're on there called Mexican American Mojo, and it goes back to the roots into the 20s, into the 30s, certainly into the 40s and 50s, and you get into Richie Valens, who was Richie Valenzuela originally, right? Richie Valens with the song La Bamba, and its combination of music from Son Jarocho influences. That's really where that comes from. Son Jarocho is a style of music, regional music from Veracruz, and so that plays a small component in there. But really, when we're talking about the confluence of influences, you have primarily black music and white music, and that stays that way for a long time. You don't really see Asian influences coming in much, but you certainly do now. Those of you that are familiar with J-pop and K-pop and all of that kind of stuff. But that music is super, super influenced by American music, which is super, super influenced by black music and European harmonies and all of that. So it all blends together. So when we talk about those cultures, that's primarily what we're dealing with. Things open up more, and you'd certainly see that. And there was a scene that came out in the 80s with rock en español, and then we've seen certainly a lot more influence of music, Spanish language music, with all sorts of different styles. So a lot of you, that's your point of reference, and that's really cool too. But that's really why we keep focusing on black versus white. So getting back to my point was that there were a lot of families, and what I was trying to get to is that don't just think too, when we talk about racial issues and things like that, that white people are the only people that are racist, and that nobody else is. And I know that there's been some redefining of the terms, and I'm not even going to begin to go down that path right now because it's not pertinent to this class necessarily. But when it's easy to kind of generalize and stereotype and say, well, white people were all racist and nobody else was, and that's not true because all cultures are racist. Again, taking aside the way things have been redefined. But so my point is that the term rhythm and blues was very much known as a black style of music, a black genre influenced out of the rhythms that ultimately go back to Africa, that have been influenced coming up through South America. From all of those influences, the harmonies that came from the European traditions. And so this term rhythm and blues was very much viewed as a black style of music. So if you were not black Meaning, if you were white, if you were Latino, if you were Asian, if you were any of those things, there's a lot of racism even in those cultures. And so they didn't necessarily like the term rhythm and blues because that was a black thing, if you get what I mean, if that makes sense. And so a DJ by the name of Alan Freed took a term that was already around, rock and roll, and then framed it as a new genre when really what it was a renaming of rhythm and blues. And now it became much safer from a racial standpoint. So I hope that makes sense. And there was a similar thing that happened, when I was growing up, when rap came out. So I was a teenager when rap came out, and everyone just called it rap, and that's just what it was. And then all of a sudden, and I really heard it more in terms of music, the term hip hop. Hip hop was a culture. It was a culture that came out of New York, and we'll learn about that down the line. It was not a style of music, but things started to shift. And I think a lot of it was because when gangster rap came out in the late 80s, when you had NWA and Public Enemy and folks like that, rap really got a bad name, and so people started calling it hip hop, which is a safer term. So that's kind of a similar thing. So we get into that, and then we get into rock and roll. Into the 1950s, you learned about Rock Around the Clock, and I did the little show and tell last week, and that was used in the movie Blackboard Jungle. And that's another thing, I want you to be mindful of in this class, is the role that television and movies play in the history of rock and roll, and still play in terms of the fame of a lot of artists. So Elvis became huge because of his style of music and his singing. He had a popular career. He ended up getting drafted. He came back. Even before that, he started appearing in movies and became a movie star, became a bigger movie star in some ways for a certain time period than he was as a singer. And so television shows in the 50s, American Bandstand and Hullabaloo and all these things, they played big, significant roles in the fame of many artists, because now you have people all across the country and then eventually later globally seeing these artists. And so it plays a very significant role, certainly with Elvis. So you learned about Elvis, the big game changer, right? He was the most important person in the history of rock and roll. Now, nothing exists in a vacuum, which is one of my, big sayings. So Elvis couldn't have been Elvis without having the influences of the black music that he loved and covered. The producers, people like Sam Phillips, the radio DJs, all of that came out. He made the careers bigger for the black artists that preceded him, particularly Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Fats Domino. He also opened the doors for a lot of white musicians as they started doing rock and roll that probably never would have made it through. So as I mentioned last week, you have people like Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis. Even through all of that, Ritchie Valens becomes popular, and he shows up a little bit in the last week's materials and this week's materials. And I think La Bamba was not only a huge hit again for coming as a Mexican style, but in Spanish language that was like revolutionary. That was a huge deal when that came out in the 50s. And sadly, Ritchie Valens, Buddy Holly, and the Big Bopper died in a famous plane crash on February 3rd. And in 1959, and that was known to a lot of people as the day the music died. And as a fun little tidbit, if you know the Don McLean song American Pie, bye bye Miss American Pie, that one, that when he refers to the day the music died, that is what he's talking about, is that plane crash. But then that song is an amazing rock history lesson. So as you go back and listen to that song, once you're done with this class, you'll be able to plug in a lot more pieces, because he makes these cryptic references to all sorts of bands and artists, even carrying on after that plane crash. So we then get into teen-styled rock and roll, and that's where we start now. So you heard early rock and roll. So now what happens is, in the late 50s, rock and roll is really disliked it's disliked by a lot of people. It's disliked because it believes that it's bringing a lot of negative, racially fused influences into popular culture. And so it's disliked in a lot of ways. And so what happens in the end of the 50s is a number of things happen. Elvis gets drafted. Chuck Berry gets arrested because he's taken an underage girl across state lines, and who wasn't black. Little Richard gives up music and becomes a preacher. And Buddy Holly, who I mentioned, dies in a plane crash. Jerry Lee Lewis gets in trouble because he marries his third cousin, who was 13 at the time. Yeah, I know, creepy, right? Super creepy. And so all these things happen, and there's this little like vacuum in the world, and things change. And what changes in music, and you're going to learn about all of this. So I'm not going to like go into great extent teaching you all of these things, but just setting up these chapters for you. So you got 5 chapters. There is a ton in these chapters, so be ready for that. First of all, rock and roll fades, and you have the rise of what we call teen pop, teen idol pop. And so remember, popular music means that a lot of people are listening to it. It's commercially lucrative, all of that. And so what happens is rock and roll becomes becomes popular with the teenagers. Rock and roll kind of fades, and the music business is like, hey, there's a bunch of money to be made here. And so they start marketing to teenagers. This is revolutionary in the late 50s, early 60s. So they marketed to little kids, and then they would market to adults, but teenagers weren't really a market until now. And the reason is that after World War II, which ends in 1945, people come home, they move, they're a little more affluent, and teenage kids start getting allowance, and they start getting some money to spend on. And so what are teenagers going to spend their money on? They're going to spend it on music, on records. They're going to spend it on fashions, right? Clothes. They're going to spend it on food. A lot of the same things that are still around today. Some have changed, some not. And so what happens is the music business is like, hey, we got a captive audience here. We got to start marketing to them. And so what they do, one of the things that they do is they create this teen idol pop. So if you're into K-pop, J-pop, there are a lot of pop artists. And in fact, I want you to start thinking about it now, because it's going to show up in an assignment possibly, to think about pop music now. Pop music now is probably maybe even more popular than it's ever been. And it serves certain purposes. In the teen idol pop in the late 50s and early 60s, it started in the late 50s. And here's the thing. I mentioned that everything's closely connected to the textbook. One pitfall that students make is they try to read the introduction and then answer off of that. It's sort of like using the Cliff Notes for the book, although it's even worse, because the introductions just set up the chapter, kind of like what I'm doing. And so when students just go, well, I'll just go off the introduction, that's just the beginning of the information. That's not the real information. And so you won't be able to do a good job if you're doing that. The other thing is that sometimes students will just glance at the materials, and let's say that a chapter, it's very common for a chapter to start off saying, okay, earlier in the 40s, this thing started to happen with the crooners, Frank Sinatra, Perry Como, Bing Crosby. And as that evolved, because again, nothing exists in a vacuum, everything has an influence. Everything comes from somewhere. That eventually leads into this. So even when teen idol pop begins, it's not this fresh, brand new thing, because Sinatra and those other guys, those crooners, were in the 40s and 50s. They were reaching those young audiences as well. So sometimes students will read like the beginning of it, and then they'll go, oh, there's my answer. No, that's not your answer. You got to actually go through the whole thing to get the answer. I will tell you now, everything you need to know is in the book and in the online materials. Okay, it's all there. All right, so they start marketing to these kids, and they create these teen idol pop stars that are really created as like fabricated boyfriends and girlfriends, and you'll learn about how that works. I could go into it all, but then you wouldn't read, right? So what's the fun of that? So you're going to learn about that. And then you're going to learn about, from Teen Idol Pop, you're going to learn about the Brill Building. You learned about the producer Sam Phillips but you're going to learn about Phil Spector, who is a very interesting character, a very troubled man, but a brilliant producer. And you're going to learn about what a style of production that he developed, a technique known as the wall of sound. You're going to learn about surf music and the role that played as instrumental dance music that ultimately leads into the Beach Boys. And the Beach Boys were a hugely influential band, particularly for artists like The Who and the Beatles. And so you're going to learn about them. And then the next chapter, chapter 6, what you're going to start to see in this class is how things move, and sort of, you have white music, black music, and how they meet in rock and roll, and then they separate again. And this in some ways, when the separation happens, this wasn't a imposed separation, it just kind of developed. So, what happens out of rock and roll? One of the things you're going to learn about is with the teen songs are the importance of the dance songs, the alligator, the pony, the mashed potato, and one of the most important songs in all of rock history, the twist. So you're going to learn about that extremely important song because of what it did generationally and racially and all of that. You're going to learn about that. But then out of that, so you have Chubby Checker, black artist, does the twist, which is pretty, there's nothing distinctly black about it or white about it, and that's one of the reasons it became so important and popular. But then you're going to learn about how things start to split and move. So basically what happens is, I'm trying to do this visual. You have these influences, they come together in rock and roll, and then it explodes again. And we're going to watch this explosion of genres continue out of this. So we're going to be in the 50s/60s for a while now, as you learn about these different genres. So you're going to learn about soul and Motown, which is the thread of, black music as it carries on into the 60s. And so you'll move forward in time, then you'll move back in time, forward in time, back in time. And so soul music, you'll learn about Muscle Shoals, you'll learn about its role with Stax and Volt, and record labels, and then Atlantic, with Ahmet Ertegun and Jerry Wexler, and you're going to learn about probably my two favorite soul artists, which are hugely influential, and two of my favorite artists, just period, which is Aretha Franklin and Otis Redding. I love Otis Redding. So you're going to learn about them, and then you're going to learn about Motown, which is totally a different style. Motown is short for or is named for Detroit, which was its nickname was the Motor City. You're going to learn about Berry Gordy Jr. and his goal of making music that was just loved. It was basically raceless, and it eventually became known as the Sounds of Young America. So I want you to really dig into the materials, because there are very distinct differences between soul and Motown, and you may be asked about them down the line, okay? If not this week, the following week. So I want you to be mindful of that. And again, I'll say this again, please make sure that you're listening to the playlists. This class is all about the songs. It's all about the music. So don't just try to memorize the facts. Learn what the artists sound like, what the songs sound like. Some of these songs are just some of the greatest, most moving songs ever. And that's ultimately the heart of what this class is about. And to go off on a little tangent, I think one of the most important things about what our life as we walk around the planet is these experiences that we share, and these connections that we make to the music and to each other. So you've got soul and Motown. Then you're going to learn about the British invasion. And there's 2 chapters on that. So the first one is, the first chapter is just on the Beatles and the Stones. I want to say a couple of things out the gate. The Beatles are without a doubt the most important band in the history of rock and pop ever. It's not just like, Shane says, they are. And you're going to learn why. Now, there's a lot of reasons why, and you're going to learn about the influences of Beach Boys. You'll start to make the connections on them. You're also going to start to learn about Bob Dylan in this chapter, because he was a huge influence on the Beatles. All I will say is that up until the Beatles, most music, most popular songs, certainly in the white pop world, were they were written by songwriters. Then the artists would, usually they would have studio musicians that would record them, and then the music, and then you would have the artists that sing. So Elvis is a great example of that. Elvis was not a songwriter. The Beatles, in learning what they were doing, and there are reasons why, and I'm not going to go into all of it. You're going to learn about it. Were revolutionary because they played their own instruments. They were amazing live. They wrote original songs. They recorded them all themselves. They were really the first band to do all of this. Things that we completely take for granted really developed out of that. If you just as an aside, if you're not familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, I would suggest that you find it sometime and just read it. It's a pretty easy read, but in it he talks about a lot of things about why experts become experts and all of that, but he talks about the whole idea of 10,000 hours that it takes to become an expert, and then he gives examples of how people got to that level, and one of the examples that he uses is the Beatles. I also want to point out a book. You can see it on the shelf right there. It's called How the Beatles Destroyed Rock and Roll, and it is an amazing book. It sounds like it's an anti-Beatles book, but it's basically how the Beatles took, their roots were in rock and roll, American rock and roll. Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly. In fact, the name of the band came out of the Buddy Holly influence. They started off with that, but how by the time you get through the Beatles' career into the mid-'60s, late 60s, they changed popular music in significant, profound ways. And so you're going to learn about that, or start to learn about that. I mentioned before that there are universities where there's a whole class just on the Beatles, and you can easily do that. The Beatles, we learned about the 45s. The Beatles were really one of the main bands that started to change the concept of a record, of recording a single to recording an album as an album, particularly influenced by the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, recording Sgt. Pepper's. Also the changes in instrumentation and orchestration. You go to a song like Eleanor Rigby or something, it's the same band that a couple of years earlier did, I Want to Hold Your Hand and Love Me Do. And something to think about as you're listening to the Beatles music is that the Beatles were really around as the Beatles for only 7 years. They started with other bands and things like that, and you'll learn about that. They became the Beatles in 1962, released their first single then, settled in on the John, Paul, George, and Ringo. The British invasion itself was 1964, and that was basically how the Beatles opened the door to British artists in the United States. And then because of that, you had bands like The Who, The Kinks, The Rolling Stones, and you're going to learn about all of these groups. If the Beatles hadn't done what they did, we might not ever know any of those other bands, because they're very different than what the Beatles did. The Beatles called it quits in 1969. If you haven't seen the documentary that came out, I recommend it. There's a trailer in there that came out recently, just phenomenal. And so how the Beatles changed, not only artistically in and among themselves in those 7 years, but how they changed popular music in those 7 years is profound. No one did it before. No one will ever do it again. One other last thing is that sometimes I'll hear the term the Beatles, people talk about the Beatles as a boy band. The Beatles were not ever a boy band. Now you have to understand what a boy band is. So a boy band is a band of it's typically singers. Occasionally you have artists that play, but mostly it's vocal groups. So think of like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, and they go back. The idea of boy bands actually goes back to doo-wop, and then certainly BTS and things like that, where you have One Direction is a great example as well. So basically what you have is singers that were put together by somebody else. So for the example of One Direction, these guys all I think they performed on, what was it, The Voice or not The Voice, X Factor, I think maybe. Some of you'll know better. Y'all can correct me if you want. I know it was one of those. But then Simon Cowell heard them. They didn't make it far out, but he heard all their voices, and he's like, these guys would be good together as a group. And that's what they did. So they were put together. Typically, boy bands do not write their own stuff. typically they are just entertainers, and that's the soul of it. The Beatles were never that. The only way you could even remotely call them a boy band is that they're all males. They're all guys, right? That's it. But they wrote their own stuff. They performed their own stuff. So sometimes people try to dismiss them. Now, I'm not trying to tell you that the Beatles are should be your favorite band, although I think there's something in there for everybody. I'm just telling you that they are the most important band, okay? And then out of that, the Rolling Stones, which are a very different band. I often refer to the Rolling Stones as the greatest American band that just happened to be British. Their influences, unlike the Beatles, were more rooted in American blues and rhythm and blues and country music. And so you're going to learn about that. Then you're going to learn in the next chapter about, again, the Who, the Kinks. You're going to learn about the Mersey sound. You're going to learn about America's response to it, with the Monkees and with Jimi Hendrix and artists like that. And then in the module, I'm going to teach you some about power pop, which was a term coined by Pete Townsend. And then you're going to learn about, in chapter 9, folk rock, and the singer-songwriters. So you're going to learn about Bob Dylan. And Bob Dylan is one of those. You got Elvis, you got the Beatles, and you got Bob Dylan. Those are the three most important in the whole history of all of it. And you're going to learn about why. And again, there are classes that are taught on just Bob Dylan alone. So you're going to learn about the influences that came before Bob Dylan. You're going to learn about the Weavers and the Almanac Singers. You're going to learn about how the history that they brought over from Europe. And then you're going to learn about the folk singer scene that came up in the 50s. You're going to learn about Woody Guthrie into Bob Dylan and the importance of that. And then that's going to move into folk rock, which Bob Dylan played a role into. And you're going to start from this point on learning about different genres that are broken off from rock. So whether that's you have folk rock, then you learn eventually about jazz rock, country rock, hard rock, heavy metal, all of these different things that are going to come out of this. Progressive rock, glitter rock. That's next week, right? So we'll get into all of these things. So a couple of other things that I want to point out that are just important from a historical perspective or technological perspective that you need to know. One, I mentioned that the movement, so the 45 and the LP came out in 1948, but the LP really took over as the primary vehicle for getting music, not counting radio, of course, in that late 60s, mid to late 60s, and that was really pushed by the Beach Boys and the Beatles. Radio. All radio, I don't know how much I went into radio in the last video, but radio is hugely important to pop music history, rock music history. And so radio, when we talk about radio, all the way up until the mid to late 60s, we're primarily focusing on AM radio. But in the mid to late 60s, FM radio becomes a thing. And so a lot of artists, AM radio is really geared towards pop artists, 3-minute songs, things like that. When FM radio comes on, that starts to change the landscape, because artists and songs that would maybe never have been played on AM radio start to get played. So that becomes a factor. And then from a political, sociological standpoint, a couple important things that are going to be significant in this chapter and moving on. Remember that I mentioned about the Korean War. That was in the early 50s. The Vietnam War started in the mid 50s, really as a police action. A lot of this was because of the Cold War and the battle between communism and capitalism. And so you have to understand that is going around the world. And so there is this Cold War, which means that it's not a battle that was being fought, on the ground, as it were, between really Russia, as they were trying to move more and more of the world to be communist. We've seen how that has largely failed. Even the few that are still kind of around out of that, Cuba, China, those ones have actually had to modify their system, because communism is not only evil, but it doesn't work because people are greedy and they can't put others ahead of themselves as a whole. You know, we may be able to do that for a day or two, but the roots of that come out of there. I think really the only thing that's surviving, if you will, in that ideology is North Korea, and we know how well things are going with North Korea. So so it's important to understand that Cold War. So Vietnam really came out of that as there was a move to communize, more of Asia. And so that police action turned into a war. The draft came into play, and you had a lot of young men that were getting drafted, and many of them not coming back. And those that were coming back with, drug problems, PTSD problems. They were, because it was such an unpopular war, and I think for some good reasons, they were really looked down upon. Still, to this day, a lot of the vets that are out there, the homeless vets, are out of that era, those that have still survived. So it's important to understand that runs through the whole 60s. So as you're learning about things that are in the 60s, you have to think about that. President Kennedy, JFK, was assassinated in 1963. That plays a significant role. The civil rights movement runs through all of the 60s. One could argue that in some ways the remnants are still around today. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, as was Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother. All of these things are happening, and they will influence, because the music is always a product of its time. And so they will influence everything that happens in this week's materials and even into next week's materials. So they are factors, but you can't disassociate those things from this. I know this was a long video, but again, if you think that normally it's 10 to 15 minutes, I would do, we got 5 modules with very dense material. I made this as quick as I can to try to help you to set things up. I hope you're getting to this early. I hope lessons have been learned and everybody's getting to this Monday or Tuesday, that you're answering the questions that are coming along, this helps you to understand the material. So read the book, read the material in the modules, watch the videos, listen to the music, take everything in, and then for your assignments, think about the things that you are learning. And I often will ask questions on what is going along today. If I'm asking about the current scene, by the way, I am specifically focusing on like right now, within the last year-ish or two. So I don't want things that are 5 years old, 10 years old, 20 years old. I want, you being mindful of what's happening in the world today. Okay? I hope that that this helps. I know they're long, but hang in there, because when you're done with this week, you're halfway done with the class. That's it. Have a great week. Keep up the good work. Bye.